Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep on a topic that's often misunderstood, Native American history and culture.
Yeah.
You sent over this book, All the Real Indians Died Off, by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz.
Yes.
And it seems like it's going to challenge a lot of assumptions.
Absolutely.
Are you ready to dive in?
I'm ready.
Okay.
This book tackles some seriously persistent myths about Native Americans, and really traces those myths back to the roots of colonization.
Okay.
And what's really fascinating is how these myths weren't just stories. They were tools that were used to justify taking land, attempting cultural erasure, just all these really awful actions.
So it's not just about setting the record straight. It's about understanding how these misconceptions are still impacting Native people today.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll be examining those myths, delving into their historical context and connecting them to the bigger picture of colonization.
Okay, let's unpack this. The first myth that Dunbar Ortiz tackles is all the real Indians died off.
Right.
I mean, you still hear that sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's shocking how often that pops up.
Right.
And it really feeds this idea that Native Americans are a relic of the past, ignoring their vibrant presence and resilience.
Right.
But think about it, who benefits from believing that Native Americans are gone?
Those who want their land for one.
Precisely.
Yeah.
This myth was woven into colonial narratives as a way to justify taking land.
Yeah.
It's like saying, well, they're gone, so it's ours now.
Right.
And the book calls these master narratives.
Okay.
These are stories that are designed to serve specific agendas.
Okay.
And,
That makes sense.
a good example of this is the Kennewick Man controversy.
Oh, yeah. Remind me about that one.
Yeah.
Wasn't that a skeleton that was found in Washington State?
Yeah. So the discovery of Kennewick Man, or as local tribes called him, the Ancient One,
Okay.
turned into this huge legal battle. And some argued, based on his skull structure, that he wasn't actually related to modern tribes,
Okay.
which would mean that he wouldn't be protected by repatriation laws.
So they're trying to use science to disconnect him from present-day Native American.
Exactly.
Right.
Control the narrative, you control the past, you can control the future.
Right.
But DNA evidence eventually proved his genetic link to present-day tribes,
Okay.
which led to his rightful repatriation.
Okay, so this is a case where science was on the side of justice.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a reminder that science can be used for or against justice.
Wow. It really makes you think about the power of controlling how history is told.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's at the heart of the second myth, too.
Right.
Indians were the first immigrants to the Western Hemisphere.
That old Bering Strait land bridge theory,
Right.
always presented as the explanation.
Yeah.
But Dunbar Ortiz really digs into how problematic it is.
Okay.
Because if Native Americans are just another immigrant group, then their claim to the land is weakened.
So it's not just about when people arrived, it's about who has the right to be here.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, and the book explores these alternative theories.
Yeah.
Multiple migrations.
Right?
Maybe even by sea, which lines up with some indigenous oral histories.
Right.
The point is, claiming one simple origin story has been used to justify taking land and dismissing Native knowledge.
So again, we're seeing that pattern of minimizing Native presence and rights.
Yeah.
And that leads perfectly into our next myth, one that's been getting a lot of pushback lately.
Right.
Columbus discovered America.
Yeah.
Most of us know that's problematic.
Right.
But what's the deeper significance here?
Well, it's the foundation for a whole lot of harmful narratives.
Okay.
By framing Columbus as a hero,
Yeah.
we're erasing the violence and brutality that he inflicted on indigenous populations.
Right.
He didn't discover a new world, he invaded one.
So it's more accurate to say he initiated the exploitation and colonization of the Americas.
Exactly. And the book digs into the horrifying impacts of disease, enslavement, and outright genocide that followed.
Right.
And this myth isn't just about history.
Right.
It's linked to something called the doctrine of discovery.
I've heard of that. Can you remind me what that is?
So it's this legal principle rooted in 15th century papal bulls.
Yeah.
And it basically gave European Christian nations the right to claim any land that they discovered, even if it was already inhabited by indigenous people.
Wait, so just because they found it, they could just take it?
Yeah.
That's outrageous.
It was, and its legacy still impacts indigenous land rights to this day.
Wow.
You know, it's a prime example of how these myths have real-world consequences.
Right.
And it helps explain these movements to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day.
Right. It's about reclaiming the narrative.
Yes.
Honoring survival rather than celebrating a colonizer.
Exactly.
Okay, before we move on, can you remind our listeners how they can get their hands on a copy of this book?
Absolutely. So if you're interested in digging deeper into all the real Indians died off, our awesome producers, Rafi, Linkry, have made a PDF available at link2.eeo, Autochtons.
Okay.
Check it out.
All right, let's tackle another myth that gets romanticized.
Yeah.
Thanksgiving proves the Indians welcomed the Pilgrims.
Right.
This paints such a rosy picture.
It does.
What's the reality?
Well, think about it. European diseases were already devastating native populations before the Pilgrims even landed.
Yeah.
And this drastically shifted the power dynamic.
Okay.
So the first Thanksgiving, while maybe involving genuine sharing, was also a strategic alliance.
Right.
In a time of immense upheaval.
So not exactly a heartwarming welcome wagon moment.
More like two groups trying to survive in a rapidly changing world.
Right.
And this myth ignores the context of conflict and displacement that really define the relationship between Native Americans and colonists.
Right.
It's a dangerous oversimplification.
Yeah. And it serves to erase the struggles that Native people were already facing thanks to colonization.
Exactly.
It almost makes you wonder what other feel-good stories are hiding some dark truths.
Right. And that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll be tackling more of these myths and uncovering their connection to land dispossession, attempts at genocide, and cultural appropriation.
Sounds like we have a lot to unpack.
We do.
Can't wait to get back to it.
Me neither. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're digging even deeper into these myths surrounding Native American history and culture.
Yeah, you know, one myth that always makes me uncomfortable is this idea that the United States had no policy of genocide.
Right.
It's like people try to argue that the decimation of native populations was just an unfortunate side effect of disease.
Right. It's this dangerous argument that Dunbar Ortiz tackles head on in the book.
Okay.
And she points out how the term genocide is often debated when it comes to Native American history, almost as if acknowledging the deliberate cruelty is too much to bear.
Yeah. So it's like we're trying to downplay the intentional brutality.
Exactly. And Dunbar Ortiz reminds us that genocide isn't just about mass killing.
Right.
It's also about acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group.
So things like forced removals, like the Trail of Tears, would fall under that definition.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, was a blatant act of ethnic cleansing.
Wow.
You know, it forcibly relocated thousands of Native Americans, leading to countless deaths and the shattering of entire communities.
And the goal was to clear the land for white settlement.
Exactly.
Regardless of the human cost.
Precisely. And that brings us to the next myth, which is that the United States gave Indians their reservations.
Right.
And the book really debunks this pretty effectively, explaining how reservations were established through treaties that were often signed under duress, if not outright coercion.
So not exactly a generous gift.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They were a means of control and assimilation, a way to confine Native people to specific areas and strip them of their traditional lands.
And the book goes into the historical context surrounding reservation creation, right?
It covers westward expansion, the Indian Removal Act, and this ongoing struggle for Native sovereignty.
Right.
And it's crucial to understand that reservations are sovereign entities within the United States with their own governments and laws, even though that sovereignty has been constantly undermined.
Which leads us to the myth that Indians are wards of the state.
Right. This paternalistic view that portrays Native Americans as dependents, needing government oversight. And Dunbar Ortiz challenges this by highlighting the concept of tribal sovereignty and the government-to-government relationship that should exist between tribes and the federal government. But this relationship has been plagued by broken promises and a blatant disregard for treaty rights.
It sounds like that power imbalance has contributed to some serious economic disparities.
Absolutely.
In Native communities.
Which brings us to the myth that most Indians are on government welfare.
Right.
You know, the stereotype that's used to dismiss Native struggles and paint them as lazy or dependent.
So what's the reality?
So Dunbar Ortiz explains that federal support for tribes stems from treaty obligations
Okay.
and a trust responsibility that the U.S. government has towards Native nations.
Okay.
It's not welfare. It's a legal and moral obligation
Okay.
stemming from broken agreements and stolen land.
It sounds more like reparations than handouts.
Exactly. And the book points out the chronic underfunding of the Indian Health Service
Right.
and other federal programs that are meant to serve Native communities,
Right.
which further highlights the government's failure to uphold its responsibilities.
And yet we have this persistent image of the rich casino Indian, thanks to the myth that Indian casinos make them all rich.
Right. This myth completely ignores the reality.
Cool.
While some tribes have benefited from gaming revenue,
Right.
many others continue to face severe economic challenges.
Right.
The distribution of wealth is uneven.
Okay.
And the stereotype of the rich casino Indian is often used to justify cutting funding
Mhm.
and dismissing valid claims of injustice.
It's a way to silence Native voices and pretend that everything is fine.
Exactly. And this ties into the myth that Indians are anti-science.
Okay.
A stereotype that's rooted in colonial thinking
Mm-hmm.
that positions Western science as the only valid form of knowledge.
But Dunbar Ortiz points out that indigenous peoples have a long history of scientific innovation.
Yes, she highlights their sophisticated agricultural practices, their medicinal knowledge, their understanding of astronomy.
Right.
Native science emphasizes a holistic understanding of the natural world, one that's interconnected with cultural values, spirituality, and respect for the environment.
It's a reminder that there are multiple ways of knowing,
Exactly.
and that Western science doesn't hold a monopoly on truth.
Right, and organizations like AZES and SACNAS are working to promote Native participation in STEM fields,
Okay.
demonstrating the compatibility of these seemingly different knowledge systems.
That makes me think about another harmful stereotype, the idea that Indians are naturally predisposed to alcoholism,
Right.
and it seems like it's often used to explain away the high rates of alcohol abuse in some Native communities.
Yeah.
Without addressing the root causes.
You're right. Dunbar Ortiz confronts this myth directly,
Okay.
dismantling this dangerous notion that Native Americans are genetically prone to alcoholism.
Okay.
She points to historical trauma, ongoing oppression, social factors as major contributors to this issue.
So it's not about genetics, it's about the devastating impact of colonization.
Exactly. And the book highlights the resilience and cultural practices within Native communities that promote healing and recovery. It emphasizes the importance of understanding the root causes
Right.
and working towards solutions that address the underlying issues,
Right.
not just the symptoms.
And that leads us to a myth that's especially harmful to Native women.
Right.
What's the problem with thinking of Indian women as princesses or squaws?
Yeah, this myth is rooted in a colonial mindset
Okay.
that hypersexualizes and dehumanizes Native women.
Right.
And Dunbar Ortiz discusses how these limiting and inaccurate portrayals ignore the strength, diversity, and lived experiences of Native women.
It reduces them to caricatures and fuels the epidemic of violence that they face.
Exactly. And the book highlights the work of Native activists and scholars who are challenging these stereotypes and fighting for the safety and sovereignty of Native women.
It's a reminder that these myths have real-world consequences.
Yes.
And that we all have a responsibility to challenge them.
Yeah.
Speaking of challenging myths, we have one more to unpack before we wrap up.
Let's dive into it.
Okay, so we're back for this final part of our deep dive into all the real Indians died off.
Yeah.
And it's been really eye-opening to see how these myths connect to a bigger story of power and control.
You hit the nail on the head. It's all about maintaining systems
Right.
that benefit from the dispossession of indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And one way to do that is by controlling how they're perceived,
Right.
even down to what they're called.
Which brings us to our final myth.
Yes.
Native Americans can't agree on what to be called.
Right.
It's almost like it's used as an excuse
Yeah.
to avoid respecting their preferences.
It definitely feels that way.
Yeah.
And Dunbar Ortiz points out that the very terms Indian, Native American, American Indian, all of these are imposed labels rooted in colonialism.
Right.
You know, they erase the vast diversity of indigenous nations.
She encourages using specific tribal affiliations whenever possible, right?
Yes, it's about recognizing that Native American isn't a one-size-fits-all label.
Right.
It's about respecting tribal sovereignty and self-determination,
Okay.
even in something as simple as a name.
It's a powerful reminder that language matters.
Yes.
And throughout this deep dive, it's become clear that these myths aren't just harmless misconceptions.
Right.
They're tools that are used to justify historical and ongoing injustices.
Exactly. Debunking them is a form of activism.
Yeah.
It's about challenging these dominant narratives and creating space for authentic Native voices.
Dunbar-Ortiz concludes the book with a historical timeline.
Yes.
Which is such a striking reminder of the resilience of Native cultures.
It really highlights the enduring strength and presence of indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
Despite facing centuries of oppression.
So if we could distill one key message for our listeners, it would
Native
be...
Americans are still here.
Yeah.
They are diverse, resilient people with rich histories and cultures that deserve to be honored and respected.
And their stories need to be told from their perspective.
Yes.
Not through the lens of these harmful myths.
Absolutely. It's time to move beyond the stereotypes and engage with the complex realities of Native American history and contemporary life.
And for those who want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out All the Real Indians Died Off.
Yes.
You can find a PDF version at linktr.ee/Toctons, courtesy of our amazing producers, Rafi Linkry.
It's a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to challenge their own assumptions and gain a deeper understanding of these issues.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked a curiosity to learn more and to engage with Native American history and culture in a respectful and meaningful way.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, keep listening to the voices of those who have been silenced for far too long.